I love this image for the meditation. So if you want to use that as a visual, I think it's a wonderful piece to be with the spiral. And it takes us inward. And I believe that's what meditation can do. So let's just settle in. Let us all breathe and awaken to this moment, knowing there's no other place we need to be. There's nothing else we need to be doing. We have chosen to be here. So let us follow that spiral and enter our hearts. Let us praise Mother Earth in all her springtime splendor, the red buds, daffodils. Let us welcome Easter, and also be aware of so much that is happening in this world. May we offer our prayers for those who may be suffering in mind, body, and spirit. May we also remember those in our lives, friends and members of this congregation, friends and family, knowing their joys and sorrows, confusions and clarities, the losses and gains, the grief and hope that is all part of life. Today, as we enter into our hearts, our own compassion, may we be aware of that which shuts our hearts off from life and that which opens us to life. And I will offer these words from my colleague, Richard Gilbert. A tomb is no place to stay, be it a cave in the Judean hills or the dark cavern of the spirit. A tomb is no place to stay when grass rolls away, the stone of winter cold and valiant flower burst their way to warmth and light. And a tomb is no place to stay when each morning announces our reprieve and we know we are granted yet another day of living. A tomb is no place to stay when life laughs a welcome to hearts that have been away too long. So may it be. Amen. Shalom. Shalom. I want you to know that this sermon was blessed because we have 3 new baby chicks. And when I went in to get the print, I forgot we'd moved the chicks into the office, which was a little warmer. And so I was in there getting the printed sermon and they're all going, so it has been blessed properly for Easter. So here we are at Oak Landon Universalist Unitarian Church, where God is love. We know Easter is a time of joy and awakening. For Christians throughout the world this morning, Easter is a celebration marking the resurrection of one Jesus of Nazareth. For Unitarian Universalists, it is a time to celebrate the mystery of life, the miracle of renewal, and also to think about this man, Jesus of Nazareth, whose life and death created and continues to create a following in his name. Notice I didn't say religion, because I don't think Jesus was trying to create a new religion in his name. He was a Jew who was challenging the Jewish authorities at the time and their interpretations of scripture. So that's why he went to the temple to talk to the Jewish folks there. He was a Jew, and to say, I think this is how this needs to be interpreted. As important as that, he was also a Jew who challenged the Roman Empire, the oppressor, that which was keeping people in their place. And he brought a liberating message to the people. And yes, he had a following. So many people ask, who was Jesus of Nazareth? What do we really know about him? Like from historical records, not from the Bible, which was written quite a bit later. Houston Smith, the renowned world religion scholar, author of The World's Religion, says this about the actual biographical details we have about Jesus. They are somewhat meager. He was born in Palestine, probably about 4 BC, grew up in Nazareth. He was baptized, which was an ancient Jewish rite of passage, by a prophet named John. And John was electrifying the region with his proclamation of God's coming kingdom at the time. In his early 30s, so there's a big gap, we don't know much about it all, Jesus of Nazareth had a teaching and healing career that lasted, we think, between 1 and 3 years. And in time, he incurred the suspicion of Rome, which led to his crucifixion. So these are the facts which historians agree upon. And here's the one thing I highlighted it earlier. Jesus was born a Jew and the subject of an oppressive Roman Empire, which ruled over the land. Now, scholars differ between what they thought was Jesus' social class, but it was clear he was rooted in Judaism of his time. So he was born, lived, taught, and died a Jew. So the arguments in the Bible, which some people see as Jesus condemning the Jews, it was like, no, he was arguing with his own people. It'd be like if we got some Unitarian Universalists in here and we're arguing with each other about a particular way to interpret something. That's what was happening in his time. A lot of this depends on who is telling the story. So when we go to Unitarian Universalists, where God is love, and we gather on Easter morning together in all of our theological diversity, and we are throughout the globe, but mainly in the United States and Canada, we gather as liberal religious seekers. And we have identities and inspirations from humanist teachings, Buddhist, Jews, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, earth-centered traditions, and so many other spiritual paths. Many of us just say, I am a seeker. I'm seeking truth in the name of love. Some of us are theists, we believe in God, and some, maybe we haven't quite named it yet, and others are not. And some are agnostic, many. I'm not quite sure. And then I saw a bumper sticker once that said, militant agnostic. I don't know, and neither do you. A little much. So here we are with the story of Jesus that has been spread through the world with so many different interpretations. Some of you know that the evangelical religions have really gone down into Central and South America. Before that, and as that was happening, there was also something called liberation theology. And that type of theology is looking at Jesus' story as against rulers and fascist governments, the empires of the time. Those are the tomb that we want to escape from. In other places, the Jesus story, Christianity was introduced in the lives of others as part of an imperialistic colonization, often disregarding the local traditions and indigenous cultures and wisdom, sometimes to the point of annihilation or near annihilation. And unfortunately, we just need to look at our own country and what happened to Native Americans here in this land. Almost losing their language and culture, sent off to schools. And right now, in our country, there is a heaviness. We are in a war, and we do have a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of War, who is changing the language from geopolitical to religious language, and sometimes invoking, actually, religious themes, scripture, and even symbolism from the Crusades. And basically, when you do that, you're saying we are the religion and we're the best, and the enemy is less than us. We as Unitarian Universalists believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all people. So this is frightening that this is happening. In fact, our president just yesterday ended a piece on his Truth Social that said, "Glory be to God," after saying the violence that was going to happen. This is happening in our country, I was very pleased to see that Pope Leo of the Catholic Church. That guy's rocking right now. And he called President Trump out by name and said, "You have got to find an off-ramp for this war before it escalates too much." So religious leaders are stepping up, and we need them to do that. And I wanted to say that as part of today, to step out of that tomb. When oppression does one thing, it isolates. We start feeling afraid and we get isolated from others. And community becomes so important. So my question, or what I want to do, is enter this Easter part and looking first at your stories. What memories of Easter, if any, are part of your life? Now I'm going to offer some possible scenarios for a group of Unitarian Universalists, which some of you grew up. Maybe and Easter was not a part of your story at all. You may have grown up in another religious tradition or not at all. Your parents decided, no more. You may have heard about Easter perhaps in its pagan connections with colorful eggs and proliferating bunnies, I like to say, and the story of Jesus Nazareth as the stories of Holy Week. So for those of you who may have been in a Christian religion, you would have heard about Jesus coming into Jerusalem. That's Palm Sunday, the Last Supper, the betrayal that happens with Judas, the crucifixion, the resurrection. Some of that was part of your stories, and some of you, it just wasn't. For a few of you who actually grew up Unitarian Universalists, are there any here that did? Yes. You kind of struggle with Easter, not quite knowing what to do, but going metaphorical with resurrection as a metaphor for rejuvenation, emphasizing this time of year of rebirth and spring as winter fades, going back to old stories like Persephone, who was taken down to Hades, and then coming up with her mother, Demeter, 6 months out of the year, where we have spring and summer, and then going back where winter comes. There is the Jewish Passover story about the liberation of enslaved people from Egypt, who was celebrated this past week. There's colorful celebrations in Hinduism this time of year. Pagan writes a story. There is this old tale of Astara, the ancient Germanic goddess of spring, who came upon a wounded bird. Now, her animal that she was known for was a hare, which was, rabbits were much more sacred back in that time. And so in order for the bird to recover, she changed it into a hare. And then the hare responded by laying colored eggs for her yearly festival. Does that sound good? Everybody's always like, where do we get rabbits laying eggs? Well, it was Astara many, many moons ago. For some of you, you may have grown up with a rendition of the Jesus story that may have been inspirational, but also harsh, even abusive for some. I've heard these stories. Believe this, or bad things will happen to you. Believe this, or we will no longer consider you part of our group. Believe this, or you will go to hell. There are many different ways this has been interpreted. And there are, like the Catholic religion, some ceremonies and rituals held that for some of you still have some meaning and appeal. And for others, these rituals may have felt empty and lacking and still do. And for some, Easter is full of colorful hats, fine dress, and praise music, and it is so full of hope. I love it. For many of you who grew up with any story of Easter know about, you have probably changed your initial understanding, yet parts may still be with you. And I ask about your story again as you understand your own sense of renewal during this time, but also, what does this have to do with the story of Jesus of Nazareth? Asked my friend Shauna, who grew up in the Bronx, a Jew in the Bronx, I said, what do you remember about Easter? She said, very little, because Passover was such a big festival for us. And then she ended saying, well, I did remember the song about the Easter bonnet and the frills upon it, but that was about it. So you see, Christianity's been happening in our country, but there have been places where it was not the primary story. For me, I grew up in a very small Presbyterian church in a very small town in Indiana, and I was really bored. I did not understand this connection with the story of Jesus of Nazareth, of this, like, why are we learning about this? And it was not explained in a way for me to understand. And my biggest question growing up was, my buddies who I played basketball and football with was, why do the Catholics get off Good Friday and we don't? You know, it was stuff like that that really bugged me. Where did I learn the story of Jesus? How many of you have heard the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar? It's an amazing theological telling of the Jesus story. And somehow our family, when I was in high school, not at Easter, oddly enough, but at New Year's, we started singing it all the way through, starting at 11 p.m., going through, stopping at midnight to, you know, kind of do Old Lang Syne, and then we pick up and go to 1 o'clock, singing the Jesus story, which is full of passion and a lot of emotion. And that is how I kind of fell in love with the Jesus story at that point. We would carry on with all of that until the sorrowful end, when the rock star on the album, Ted Neely, says at the end, you know, into your, that said, I have commended my spirit, and then says, it is finished. And then there's some mystifying music, and it gets very quiet. And our small group would slowly clean up after New Year's. And what I remember about that time is just the poignancy. At that time, saying farewell to the year, being grateful for the family and friends that had gathered, and a sense of hope for the next year. And some of you know, my family did polar plunging, so the next year we welcomed in the new year by breaking in the ice and jumping in, which I think is a very vigorous baptism of sorts. But we were retelling and telling that story every year. And it begins to have layers of meaning. I will tell you that the retelling, singing, and re-singing of that story through its dramatic rendering saw our family through numerous tragic losses. While we may have been felt abandoned by the sacredness of life at times, I can assure you that each of us did. That story was there for us to re-enter. Whoever was present for our New Year's Jesus Christ Superstar, we played whatever roles you wanted to, or more than one at once, it didn't matter. But there was this constant narrative and questions. Jesus Christ Superstar, who are you? Do you think you are what they say you are? Jesus Christ, who are you? What have you sacrificed? These are huge theological questions. I'm going to close all of this. So we're looking at the story of Easter, right? We're looking at the story of Jesus of Nazareth. I want to close with two stories. One of them is looking at the book of Mark in the Bible. And I'll tell you in a minute why I want to look at that in the context of when Jesus came along. And then I want to tell you the story of Vera Pavlova in Russia. Mark is considered the first gospel. The gospels are the 4 books that are about Jesus' life, right? We don't really know about who Mark was or where he was from, but 40 years after Jesus' death, so it'd be like you sitting down, writing about 40 years ago about something that happened, he wrote the Gospel of Mark, which we believe the other gospels were based upon. What had happened right before that? When we say the Jewish temple, it wasn't like there were temples all over. There was one temple, and it was destroyed. In Jesus' lifetime, when he said a new kingdom was coming, they thought it was going to come in his lifetime. And then when he was crucified, the followers were, what's going to happen? He was also considered a criminal, and they didn't want to be recognized with him. We don't know what happened during some of that time, but later, Mark began writing this gospel because he knew the story of Jesus. And he said, the scholar Mike White says, his audience had just seen the destruction of the temple. So Mark in his writing, which I find pastoral and also foretelling, goes back and has Jesus in his lifetime stand against and then predict the destruction of the temple and predict his own death. So he's writing 40 years later and he said, Jesus is going to predict this and this. Thus, it all becomes part of a Messiah narrative regarding Jesus, of a suffering Messiah and a possible coming kingdom and needed change. You know, we can't have this oppression anymore. And it's very interesting. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is a rather mysterious figure. He does some miracles, not all. The rest of the Gospels added some. But mainly he speaks in parables, which are really hard to pin down, even nowadays. Is he the Messiah or not? It's not always clear. He kind of reveals and then conceals his identity, and in theological terms, is known as the messianic secret. So it's like, am I the Messiah? He'll give you a little idea over here, then it will sound like he's not. Part of this hidden identity is because Mark intends Jesus' messianic identity to be tied to the actual suffering and death, something the people of that time could relate to. They were suffering. So seeing somebody who suffered. Some call the Gospel of Mark a passion narrative with just an extended introduction at the beginning. Now, the Gospel of Mark does not present Jesus' death as a romanticized hero, like his fellow Jews who had been traumatized by the onslaught of the Romans and the destruction of the temple. Jesus himself feels abandoned by God and asks, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And you bet people in that time could relate to that. You bet people in our time could relate to that. God is love, and yet sometimes our heart is in that tomb and we can't feel it. Why have you forsaken me? By the way, that's in Jesus Christ Superstar too, in case you listen to the Rock Dropper. And here's the thing, in the original Gospel of Mark, the narrative simply ends with the empty tomb. And absent Jesus, Mary Magdalene is there with Mary, the mother of James and Jesus, and they've come to anoint the body. There's a young man there in a white robe, and he tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead and to go tell his disciples. And here's how the gospel ends. So they went out, the two women, and fled the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. When you look at that word afraid and how it was translated, usually that word is translated to be in awe of the presence of the divine. So here's what they said. So they went out and fled the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were in such awe in the presence of the divine. It's amazing what the Gospels have changed in terms of women. First of all, it's very much believed now that Mary Magdalene was one of the main disciples. But they took her out. The gospel that she wrote was taken out. Women were taken out. But here they were, these women full of awe in the presence of the divine. And they made it into one word, afraid. Please, come on. So that's it in Mark. There's no appearances by Jesus, no interactions. And this is what the religious scholar Elaine Pagel says of this original ending of Mark. There is a divine mystery in its end, because it ends in divine mystery. In God's return, that may happen yet, that sense of hope as those women sit there in divine awe of something they have just experienced. And so Mark asks us to stand at that empty tomb ourselves, and can we open our hearts to be in that sense of awe with life? A tomb is no place to stay, be it a cave in the Judean hills or the dark cavern of our spirit. A tomb is no place to stay when fresh grass rolls away the stone of winter, cold and valiant flowers burst their way to warmth and light. A tomb is no place to stay when each morning announces our reprieve and we know we are granted yet another day of living. And a tomb is no place to stay when life laughs a welcome to hearts that have been away too long. That, to me, is the message of Easter. And this one last piece. I asked a friend of mine, Anna, who grew up in Moscow, what Easter memories she had a few years ago. I asked her, she said, my Easter memories growing up in Moscow, Russia, involve celebrating secretively, yet profoundly and joyfully. And that's what she always gives me as a message. You've got to keep your joy. Stop letting yourself be so oppressed. She said because the official religion at the time of her birth in 1972 in the USSR was atheism. So the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church were tolerated but not promoted. And she said, my mom and her friends who were still young could not openly display an icon or attend a church service without fear of repercussions at work, which gives me great gratitude to even be here with you all today. She said that time of year also made it clear to families of my Jewish and Muslim friends that they had traditions to follow too, and she loved that. And she said, despite the fears, celebrate Easter we did. In our 9-family communal apartment, our family consisting of my mother, my uncle, and I was the youngest. I was the only child in this whole apartment. My uncle was the only male under 50, and my mom was the youngest of the ladies, ruling the communal kitchen of 9 gas stoves. My uncle and I did a lot of the scrubbing of the floors on what was called Clean Thursday before Easter Sunday, making sure everything was spotless. After all, the ladies, including my mom, had more important things to do: pressing linens, measuring yeast for baking Easter cakes, soaking eggs in onion peels to color them brown, making pyramid-shaped pashkas from cottage cheese, cinnamon, and raisins. It all had to be completed by Friday night to ensure that Saturday was left for fasting and reflection. And Vera Pavlovna, who was retired, was daring enough to take our Easter cakes to the overnight church service Saturday to be blessed. And she did that for everyone. On Easter Sundays, I got up, the sound of church bells ringing on all nearby churches. Mom gave me a plate of colored eggs to share with our neighbors. I knocked on their room doors loudly, pronouncing, Christos voskresie. And they joyfully replied, Voinstinu voskresie. Meaning, Christ is risen. Indeed, he is risen. Presenting me with a piece of Easter cake and an egg from their plates. The day was filled with friends laughing and singing, in each room having a meal full of rare food like caviar and salami. We would pick the strongest egg and bonk them against others selected strong ones to see who wins the communal egg champion. To me, said my friend Anna, Easter will always remain a time of community, of celebration, and beginning anew. I want to take that in our hearts today as we go forward, and I always think of Vera Pavlovna, who would go out in secret to get those cakes blessed. A tomb is no place to stay, be it a cave in the Judean hills or the snare that tries to entrap religious freedom. So on this morning, this Easter morning, let us not take for granted the opportunity to gather here in this place. and online for those of you who are here. Let us honor the beliefs of others and their stories that give them hope. Let us not take for granted our religious freedom, and let us not take one another for granted. This community, this place. And may we remember Vera Pavlovna when we are called to step out into ourselves. So may it be. So good to be here with you. And blessings for the courage that we need in these times. And may we keep the joy in our spirit in going forward. Amen. Our closing words come from Joel Miller. Let our lives be a prayer that waters dry souls, mends broken hearts, refuses to be terrorized, seeks this world's beauty, and carries us through its storm.